What's up, everyone? Coco Mojo here. We are about 5 weeks into Season 4, and I hope you're all enjoying it so far. We've seen a bunch of experimental changes this season, from the introduction of old dungeons into Mythic Plus, to the dinar system for targeting specific items from the raid. I'll share my thoughts about the season and what I think it means for the future of the game in another video, but for today I want to talk about Rogue in Mythic Plus for this season. So far, we're seeing Rogue getting played in a fair number of the top keys. If we take a look at the timed run leaderboard, we'll see, some of the usual suspects like Ram and Glyco. Some of the Chinese teams have rogues as well. And it really only takes going like 1 or 2 pages into the top keys in the world to start seeing a handful of rogues popping up. I mean, the season's definitely still pretty biased towards Survival Hunter and Destruction Warlock. Even with the nerfs, these two classes are just doing stupid amounts of damage. But we're still seeing quite a lot of rogues, and I think that's pretty awesome. There's one big difference though this season, and it's that most of the rogues are playing Outlaw. So here's the rogue leaderboard. We've got Ram at number 1 with 3236 Raider IO. He's playing Outlaw. All of these players are Outlaw rogues. This is their Outlaw rogue rating. And then if we take a look at Sub, which was the best rogue spec for the last couple of seasons, there's a much lower max level of Raider IO coming out of these players. So what happened here? Why are we seeing this shift from Sub to Outlaw? One big thing that we saw was all of these buffs come through for a handful of critical abilities. All of these are also going to translate into more Blade Flurry damage in AoE situations. So the Blade Flurry buff plus the 2 main builders that we have, Pistol Shot and Sinister Strike, between the eyes, one of the more important finishers. All of these changes are just welcome changes. And we're even seeing some Outlaw play in Season 3 near the end as well. Compared to all of the other rogue specs, Outlaw still brings all of the good rogue things that we've come to expect at this point. There's a couple of immunities that can be used to greed uptime on certain mechanics or avoid mechanics that may be lethal, or to help your healer out so they can pay more attention to other players on your team. Rogues are insanely tanky overall due to Feint and Crimson Vial. Rogues still have unparalleled CC that can be used in the middle of combat. It's pretty often that I find myself playing with pugs that aren't, kicking or interrupting things, and so I just take it upon myself to do all the jobs. We still have Shroud, and with no more Woe, Shroud is pretty valuable now. We can still, of course, use Invis Pots for some skips, but having your teammates be able to use DPS pots instead of Invis Pots is pretty valuable. And of course, we have pretty good damage. Rogue damage has always been pretty good. It hasn't been busted like a couple of the other specs that are seeing a lot of play, but rogue damage is overall fairly good. Another big difference in this season is that with a lot of these older dungeons, there are smaller pull sizes overall. We'll see a lot of these like 5 or 6 target pulls instead of some of the massive pulls that we would see in places like The Other Side or Halls of Atonement. And Outlaw is hard capped at 5 targets, and so all of these kind of smaller pull sizes actually fit in pretty well with the damage profile of Outlaw. Outlaw really shines in that 1 to 5 target range. Outlaw also has some pretty solid single target damage, and so this fits in nicely with the other good DPS classes that bring a ton of AoE dam. I think one of the other things that's bringing Outlaw into the limelight here is that for the last couple of seasons, we've mostly seen people play Sub. And Sub's fun, but I think players are looking for some variety, and Outlaw can have a ton of variety. It's just different from Sub, of course, but just the way that the spec works tends to lend itself to more variety. So between Roll the Bones buffs causing differences in your rotation, and different procs that come from the tier set or just part of the main Outlaw kit give a dynamic priority-based rotation rather than a fixed and predictable rotation like what you see with Sub. In terms of variety, there's also a couple of good legendaries and Covenant builds that you can play. Necro and Greenskins is the best for AoE, but it's a little bit weaker than some of the other builds on single target fights. There's also some really cool mechanics you can do with like mouse over bone spike macros and all sorts of cool UI editing that you can set up to track these debuffs. It's a pretty fun build to play. Then we have the Venthyr and Blunderbuss build. This build is best for single target, so you'll see pretty much all the rogues in Raid play this, but you also see pretty much all the top rogues in M+ playing this as well. This is because it's pretty close to Necro and Greenskins on AoE. You're, again, doing good single target damage, and that's translating into good AoE damage. It's also much simpler to play than Necro. There's no mouse over bone spike macros or tracking extra debuffs on mobs. You're really just spending the proc pretty much whenever you get it, and that's translating into more single target damage and through Blade Flurry into more AoE damage. And that simplicity is really valuable when you're looking for your assigned kick or paying close attention to some mechanics. Roll the Bones is actually a super fun ability. The feeling of getting a 5 buff while in Lust with Pot and full CDs is crazy, although the rotation kind of reduces to alternating between Sinister Strike and Dispatch and pressing between the eyes on cooldown. But you still do crazy damage, and that's pretty fun. All of the other buffs give a variety of flavors to the rotation, potentially emphasizing or de-emphasizing certain abilities. And most of the buffs are good, with the exception of Grand Melee and Buried Treasure. These buffs are kind of useless, although Grand Melee can sometimes translate into like 5 or 6 minutes of Slice and Dice duration on your Slice and Dice buff. And so aside from like the opener of the dungeon, you could potentially only press Slice and Dice a single time in a key and keep it the entire time. The pace of the spec is also really fast, which is really fun. Restless Blades gives you cooldown reduction on most of your rotational abilities. This keeps the pace really high, and you just always have cooldowns pretty much on every single pull. Your main strategy is, sticking to the rotation and pressing your cooldowns as often as possible, assuming you're going to get full value. And speaking of pace, while Adrenaline Rush is active, your global cooldown is 0.8 seconds. Have you ever heard JPC abusing his keyboard? Well, that's why. So what do you think about Rogue in Season 4 of Mythic Plus? Are you playing Outlaw, or are you sticking with Sub? Kind of alternating between the two. I actually think there's some dungeons where Sub might be the best, like, for instance, in Gambit, with all of the huge Murloc pulls, you could do a huge AoE as Sub that you just can't really do as Outlaw. But yeah, let me know in the comments what you think, and let me know also what you think about the season as a whole, whether you like some of these older dungeons turning back up and getting introduced into the Mythic Plus rotation. Yeah, let me know what you think. Good luck out there.